Alan Macfarlane, a dear friend of the show. Welcome back to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure.
Alan, we have really gone deep into the various characteristics of the English people in the conversations that we've had, and indeed their relations with the Celtic fringe of the British Isles too. And I think there are still some rocks to be lifting up and looking underneath. And let's get into those today. I think it would be good to talk about the relationship with money, a little bit about sexual relations, and also class and politics. So all of those things which you said to me at the end of our last conversation, you would not speak about at the high table at Cambridge. So on that note, Alan, in The Culture of Capitalism, one of your many books, you write about the English people's understanding of the nature of evil, and specifically with regards to money. Let's begin there. How would you describe the English people's relationship with money, how it's developed over time, and perhaps where we can see it in literature and society?
Well, there's a certain ambivalence of the famous biblical statement, which some people don't get quite right. It's not money is the root of all evil. It's the love of money that is the root of all evil. And in that sense, the English are fairly evil because it's been, in my reading, for over 1,000 years, a very monetized economy. Most peasant societies, money is important, but it's usually important on the fringes of most people's lives. Peasants and others live in mainly non-monetized economies, and money is important for the traders and merchants, but not for the mass of the populace. In England, because I argue it's been a capitalist trading market kind of society with highly individualized property and very sophisticated coinage. The Anglo-Saxons, for example, had the most sophisticated silver coinage in Europe, and they were important traders. So from the Anglo-Saxons onwards, the English have been not exactly obsessed with money, but money is just a very useful tool and not something to be frightened of. This is in some ways contradicted by several things. One is that certainly in the class system, although you should make money, as much money as you can, and money is the root of our class system, I learned from my parents and grandparents that money was something you really didn't talk about. Yeah. You just assumed you had the money, and the upper middle class and upper class have therefore tended to make as much money as possible, but it's not a dinner table subject. The second ambivalence is from Christianity, because Catholicism particularly historically was very wary of money. You weren't, for instance, allowed to lend money at interest, supposedly in Catholic societies. And money was the love of, was the root of a lot of evil. And therefore, although Catholic monasteries and Christian orders were very successful economically, and the papacy was extremely wealthy, there was also a supposed prohibition on the naked pursuit of money. So the English have had this sort of ambivalence, but it's probably along now, I discovered to a certain extent, with China, the most interested in money, and as a result it made many of the important legal and other reforms which would be the basis for modern capitalism.
So that trait of money being central to society, you say, and have found that it's been there since the Anglo-Saxon period. I wonder if there was ever a point where it sat more finely in balance with other aspects of human life. So, for instance, and I'd be interested to hear you expand on your views on this, because I know you've talked about community never really being found per se within English society wherever you've gone to look for it, though there was a civil society and civic institutions that existed, even if people were very individuated. But I wonder if they used to sit more finely in balance, because I've been reading Thomas Carlyle recently, and he takes that line that you have just described, which is there's almost an obsession with it. And because he's writing in the period of the Industrial Revolution, he talks about the English worshipping mammon, the idea of just self gain and the worship of money above all else. And he goes on to say that the cash nexus, this idea that the transaction is above all, and it has just shallowed and thinned out relations between people, is something that is very present within English society within the Industrial Revolution. Was there ever a time where the love of money didn't end up superseding all else that might matter in life, from your reading?
Well, no doubt Carlyle is a romantic and thought it was something to do with the depravity of modern civilization since the Industrial Revolution or whatever. And I would totally disagree with that. I don't think money trumps everything. There are other things which are equally important for most Englishmen through history: friendship, love, happiness of various kinds, which are not necessarily something which you can buy. As the ambivalence is there in two of the Beatles songs, of course. One is which praises money as money, money, money. You can buy everything with money. And the other says you can't buy love with money. So there is an ambivalence. I don't think there was any great shift, in other words, up to the Industrial Revolution or up to the Protestant Reformation, or there was a different kind of world. The key thing is what you can buy with money. In most societies, it's fairly limited what you can purchase. Many things aren't exchangeable in terms of money values. As far as I can see from medieval court records or agricultural estate accounts or the legal system, there was very little that was outside the purchase of money. And indeed, this is famously put, and I think I can't quote it from memory, in my piece, In the Culture of Capitalism, in a famous quotation from Shakespeare, where he says, money, you can buy anything. You turn black into white, you can turn prostitutes or whores into upright women, you can turn sin into salvation if you have money. Just get me money and I can change the world. And this is late 16th century. And I think he was roughly right. You could more or less, you can buy your way through the class system, you could buy education, you could buy salvation by having lots of obituaries for yourself or whatever it was, obits. So there wasn't very much. And the English were really, really interested in it. I mean, the famous jibe, which actually Napoleon didn't originate, but he's associated with it, that England is a country of shopkeepers. The original was it's a country run by shopkeepers, but both sayings are roughly right. As far as continentals were concerned, when they looked at the English and money, they said the country's just obsessed with money. They have no honor and they have no dignity, and they're just scrabbling around on trying to get a bit more money. I thought this was just a very Anglosphere kind of reaction. But the more I've studied Chinese history and been to China, I find exactly the same attitude through Chinese history.
Really?
And that The Chinese have been very good with money, as they are now. It's deep-rooted, and they're very interested in money. Their motivation is pushed by the fact that it's such an unstable situation with people dropping from the top to the bottom and massive calamities and famines and so on, that you really have to spend your life trying to accumulate and protect yourself against that. The English being much wealthier historically, it wasn't driven so much by an obsession to avoid famine and so on. A lot of it was driven by the fact that social status and money were so tightly interlinked. In other words, if you wanted to move up the social ladder or preserve your position, then the only way to do that was to make money. And you could buy your way up the ladder and prevent yourself from falling. And therefore, money and the approbation of your friends and neighbors and everyone else was really basically founded on your monetary position.
Perhaps we could do a comparative study here, at least on the fly, between those in England and the relationship with money amongst the English people compared to, say, China. How do the Chinese approach the concept of money, and what is their relationship with it?
Well, there's several similarities and several differences. One of the similarities is that you can describe the English as a nation of shopkeepers or ruled by shopkeepers. And the English are obsessed with money. I mean, they don't talk much about it in the upper middle classes, but everyone is very, very interested in money in this country. As the French and others observe, we just seem to be a money-grubbing kind of trading merchant kind of place, not with any honor like the French. And that can be said of the Chinese too. They're a nation of shopkeepers in the sense that they love buying and selling and making small profits. And my Chinese friends, some of them are very good entrepreneurs. They're the best entrepreneurs, the best money makers in the world, probably, which is why so many of them are very, very rich now. And they work very hard, and they're very honorable about their dealings, at least with large sums of money. So they're trustworthy, and as the British found when they went there. So they're a nation of shopkeepers. But there are differences. One basic difference is that the reason for this is somewhat different. England was a very affluent country from very early on, and the making of money was therefore an obsession not because of desperation or trying to ward off some evil, but really to climb the social ladder because England didn't have a caste system and almost anything could be bought, including social status, particularly through education, educating your children. The British loved to add to their property and make money in trading and merchant activities so that they could climb the very greasy social ladder. The Chinese motivation for making money is not that at all. The way you climb the Chinese social ladder is through education, entirely different. Since the year 605, when the formal acceptance of the examination system by the emperor was decreed in 605 AD, which is quite a long time ago. And before that, it had been in practice to a large extent like that since the Qin emperor. The way you got up to the top or the middle of China was you took competitive examinations. And if you were clever and successful or occasionally bought it or were lucky, you became on various levels. And then if you were extremely good, you got up to the imperial palace. So the Chinese weren't trying to make money for that reason. They were trying to make money because China was a desperately poor and insecure place for almost everyone. Perhaps there were 1% who were at least financially more or less all right, the Mandarins, although they could lose everything in a flip of a coin in some of the hierarchies. But for the rest, it was a land of famines, floods, political turmoil, all sorts of insecurities. And you never knew when you would be cast into destitution and your children would starve to death, or you'd have to sell them off. And therefore, hedging your bets and accumulating surpluses. And I see this even with current Chinese I know, who are always very keen to try and improve their financial situation because they don't know how long it will last. This is why I suppose China has almost the highest savings rate in the world. Something like the Chinese save about 30% of their income, which if you compare it to most countries, which only save 5 or 10% at the most. And it's one of the reasons why tariffs or Trumps will have any effect at all in China, because they just save 25% rather than 30%, whatever.
Yeah.
The Japanese are the same. They save, there's huge savings in Japan, and roughly for the same reasons, that though it wasn't as insecure politically as China, there were constant difficulties that people faced. And so the motivations are different, but the mentality, which is a love of money and what it can buy, is very similar.
I was not anticipating asking this question, but now you started to talk about Chinese rise to prominence, wealth, individual wealth, wealth at the level of the nation, and comparing it to what we see with Britain now, a highly indebted country at a national level, and individuals who certainly don't save as much as they used to, whereas they did in the past. And you spoke about the mercantile class and the wealth of England going back a long way, which you've written extensively about. Do you subscribe to that notion that Ibn Khaldun put forward, the Asabiya cycle, the strong men create good times, or should I say, hard times create strong men create good times create weak men create hard times? Do you think that if you were to compare the West, which is fraying at the edges with regards to its public finances, you could perhaps argue with regards to its morality, its ability to carry out decisive political maneuvers, and then you compare the Chinese, who have up until very recently had hard times of their own and now are looking rather imperious? Do you think that that's what's going on here, that you've got the cycles, the civilizational cycles going on, and one day that the Chinese, once they've had their decadence, they may well end up falling into that same cycle? Or do you think it's all a bump?
Well, you've asked about 10 questions then.
You're a professor emeritus at Cambridge. You can definitely handle 10 questions on the go.
I can, but only one at a time, and I have to remember which ones I'm answering. Let's take the last one, falling into decadence. I don't think the Chinese, from my reading, will fall into decadence. This kind of drive to succeed and to be secure doesn't tend to decline, as far as I can see in particular individuals or particular families. The wealthy people I know in China go on; they don't rest on their laurels, so to speak. And I think as a civilization, that'll be the case, so that there will not be this kind of cycle. The Ibn Khaldun wonderful 3-stage theory, perhaps one can put it more in the kind of metaphor or the description he gave, which was based on what he'd observed in North Africa, which was that you have people living in cities who are fairly decadent and just observing, are interested in money and small things. And around them are all these ferocious, martial people who are highly moral and energetic and vigilant and so on. And these, the wolves around the cities, come in and destroy these decadent people in the city. And that's the first stage. Then they come in, and then the second stage is that they gradually become themselves decadent. And then the third stage is another lot come down and do the same thing. So this is the 3 cycle. It was put in a much longer time scale by some of the great theorists of the early 20th century, people like Spencer and Toynbee and others, who wrote great works examining history. And of course, if you examine history over a long period, it's almost impossible that any civilization won't become decadent. I mean, it was the central theme of Gibbon's great work on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, that basically the Romans lost their martial vigor and the rest of it, and the Roman Empire collapsed. And no doubt if you examined all the other great empires, the same sort of thing happened. But one interesting thing about China, which confirms my idea that they won't go through this cycle, is that they're the only empire that hasn't collapsed. There are 4 great civilizations, I should have said, only civilization that hasn't collapsed. There are 4 great civilizations which started some 6,000 years ago or 7,000 years ago across the planet about the same time. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Middle East, the Indus Valley, and the Yellow River Valley. All these started at the same time, and they all went, or 3 of them went through this cycle. They succumbed to the barbarians at the gate and are no more. I mean, just the remains of their civilizations are there. The Chinese started, and they're still there. And they're basically not much changed in their, for example, their writing system is exactly the same. Their Taoist philosophy is the same. Their character, as far as I can see, is not much changed. Their mode of agriculture is much the same. So they survive and survive and survive. And they tame the barbarians, which is another interesting thing, something that Calderon hadn't seen. But what happens in China, because it's such a vast civilization, is that the barbarians come in, most famously the Mongols, and then the Manchus, and then the Westerners, which is happening now. And for a while, they rampage across and kill a lot of people and set up their own rulers and so on. And then they become Han. So it's the barbarians become not decadent, but Chinese, which is what is roughly happening now. The West has rampaged across China for the last 2 generations, changing its laws, changing its politics a little bit, completely changing its economics a lot, changing its family systems, its love marriages, its culture, its education, medicine. Everything has been hugely modified by Western, but it hasn't destroyed China. And I think the rollback is beginning to occur when they can start to change us a bit more, because we haven't been paying attention at all to what they're like.
China's political system right now, as you've just outlined, the civilization itself is ancient, 6,000 years old. Clearly, at various times where it has had supremacy or superiority, it has not always been under state-led capitalism or under the rubric of the Chinese Communist Party. Why do you think that system works in China? Is it something that is aligned to the Chinese character in some way? Is it, or was it something else?
It does work amazingly well, and one of the first things Westerners have to realize is that you can't get rid of it or replace it or with something better called democracy of our kind. The head of Singapore, the founder of Singapore, was asked whether democracy would work in China. And he said, of course not, it's much too big, which is the same answer you have to give for Russia too. You can't run Russia in the Western-style democratic way, and attempts to force it to do so are doomed. The reason it works are various things. Firstly, although this is circular arguing, the system is based on this Confucian philosophical system, which basically sets everything in a hierarchy. And it gives two hierarchies of superior and inferior, upper chain. It's a bit like the feudal system, but it's not based, the feudal system is based on contract. You decide to be the lord of someone and they decide to be your vassal. In the Chinese system, it's based on birth. You are the son of your father. You are the grandson of your grandfather. A woman traditionally was inferior to a male. A younger brother was inferior to an older brother. And so you get a chain from yourself through generations of ancestors of protection and patronage from above, and deference and respect and help from below. That is one great chain which goes back to 500 BC and the work of Confucius and other philosophers. But it's exactly parallel to the political chain, so that in exactly the same way you are linked to the person on the chain above you, up to the emperor. And it goes down and up. So power goes up and down through this familistic system, because the emperor is your father as well as the emperor. And this system, as a way to hold together vast numbers of people, is extremely effective. I haven't worked out the mathematics, but if you look at the English political local government system, we have 4 layers. We have the centre, and then we have counties, and then we have towns, and then we have villages. So there are 4 layers. And with that, you can encompass whatever number of villages there are in England. The Chinese have 5 layers, and the mathematics is such, I imagine, that it's exponential. So just by adding 1 further layer, every village and town in China is linked up through 5 stages up to the top. And in each case, the system works by electing someone at the bottom, who is then in the local elected organization of the village or the small town, and you have a party secretary. So you have a parallel system of the political and the elected. They then choose someone who goes to the next level, which is the big city or town, then to the province, or to the county, and then to the province, and then to China. So this way, up through the system, the 600 or 800 people who we sit in the great hall in Beijing, meeting and clapping and so on, those people are the final stage up, and above them are the 9 members of the Politburo and so on. And so it's a tiered system in which everyone doesn't vote for someone above them, but they are interlinked by a certain delegation of authority up. And then it works the other way around, that when the center decides that we're going to build a new motorway across Eurasia, then they tell everyone, and it goes down, and everyone gets on board. So it's just like the language. The language is absolutely extraordinary and brilliant for holding together 1.4 billion people, because everyone can simply read it and everyone knows it, and so everyone speaks the same language. So China has not been a nation in the sense that nations are imagined communities. I feel British. No one in China, I suspect, thought they were Chinese until 40 years ago. It might have been under Chairman Mao that they began to feel Chinese. And if you asked someone in some part of China who they were, they might say Chinese. Nationalism is only a very recent product, and it's basically a reflex action against Western nationalism. Chairman Mao and others saw what Western nationalism, the nation state, was doing to them, and they took it on board, and now nationalism is universal in China because all schools encourage it and so on. So China was never united by we the Chinese. It was united by this linguistic, political, and other tributary systems in a way that has worked for 6,000 years. So there's something going for it.
That's fascinating. I have been learning little bits about the China from the inside track, people who've been working with the Chinese and within the institutions of late. You're the next person who's come along and taught me much that I don't know, because I just see things that are written over here in the British media. Most recently, a friend of mine who was over there doing some work within the government on some kind of program. He's not actually a government employee, but he was over with the Foreign Office. Said he came away having spent time amongst lots of seasoned members of the CCP in this huge conference hall for a few days, absolutely beguiled in some way by the talent and the intellect of the leaders of the country, and all of the states and the little tributaries that go into the states as you just described them. He said it was unsettlingly meritocratic and not quite like the system you'd expect from the outside looking in. And because he works very closely with British politicians, he realized just how little we have in ways of allowing true political talent to, one, go to the top, but two, to actually hold them to account in the job that they have. And he was talking about how there are all these KPIs and various targets that needs to be hit, and if they don't, they're just gone. And it's a remarkable thing to hear, because obviously if you think about the Chinese Communist Party, you conjure up images of almost the Soviet Union, lots of smudging the figures to be able to get things done. And effectively, if you're ideologically on point, then you just get waved through, and that's that. It doesn't really matter about how good you are. But he came back with an inside track that said something totally different, which is, yes, I'm sure there's some ideological component to it, but genuinely you have to perform. And if you don't perform, you're not long for your career. It's fascinating. Well, thank you for describing that a bit. And
well, if I can just add a footnote to what you said about meritocracy in there. This is something that increasingly strikes one. If you, for example, as I have, read the autobiography of Xi Jinping and met many government officials and the ambassador to Britain at the moment and so on, you see that they've got there not only through intellect and ability, but through long and deep experience. There is no way in which you could get near the top of the Chinese political system if you hadn't been a regional governor, head of some very important institutions. In other words, you would have had to do something equivalent to being Prime Minister of Britain or being head of France, Premier of France. because you would be head of some big country which was the size of this, and you'd have done that for 10 years, and before that you'd have been equivalent to being head of an English county or several counties. And you have stage after stage. So by the time you reach the top, you have deep experience, and you have been successful in each of these jobs. If you have stopped a famine or done something useful, you will have been noticed. If you haven't been much good at it, you'll never climb any higher. So the people who run the place are extremely experienced and clever, and also versatile. You see, our leaders are puny and narrow. The normal position of leaders of China for centuries is that the leaders are rounded, intellectual and aesthetic beings. And even now, the head of big multi-billion pound companies who I've met, government officials, Xi Jinping, Chairman Mao and others, they aren't just politicians. Chairman Mao was a very good poet. He was a calligrapher. He knew a lot about Chinese history. Xi Jinping also writes poetry and does calligraphy. And all these people are artists, musicians, they do the Qing. So imagine Boris Johnson's selected poetry or Donald Trump's essays on life. It's unimaginable. So the background of these people is the sort of people we see in our House of Commons, many of whom you wonder whether if they were in any other walk of life, they would have achieved more than a very low managerial role of some kind. But you wouldn't get anywhere like that in China.
Switching gears back, at least for a moment, until we get on to another topic, toward England. So you've described the nature of the elite class, I suppose, in China and its political system. And I know you've written extensively within your work about England and the English people over at least the last millennia. And you've written a bit about class, rank, and nobility, and how there used to be there was a shared culture by class and geography. I suppose the question is how would you describe class relations? You know, how we picture the establishment, the aristocracy, and the normal folk, the common people, and how has it developed over time?
So coming back to the class system, taking Weber's definition of class, which is the ownership over the means of production, the degree to which you control the means of production. The peculiarity of the English class system, I was thinking about it this afternoon, could be summarized if you look at the four main groups. And if you apply to them the class system that you would find in France or Spain, at each level they're seriously different. Starting at the top, as Tocqueville and others pointed out, in France, Spain, Italy, and the continent, you have a blood nobility. That is to say, you have a group of people who pass on their position to their children, who are legally separate from the rest of the population. They get tried by different people and are not subject to the ordinary laws. And so they are a nobilité. It's a caste. You can't marry into them. You can't marry out of them. It's a self-preserving caste, and that was what was supposedly destroyed by the French Revolution, though it wasn't really, as Tocqueville points out. England doesn't have a caste, a nobility. You should never use the word nobility about the English. You should use aristocracy, which means well-born. And the son and children of aristocrats, many of them sink. They just disappear. and you can buy your way easily into them. And as Tocqueville said, it's not a caste system like France because you can marry into them. You can very quickly, and most of the aristocratic families are now existing haven't been here for more than 100 or 200 years. They just bought their way in or been made peers by Boris Johnson or some such. So basically, we don't have an ability. We have this very permeable aristocratic system. The next level, which is the level that basically runs, has historically run England, one of the two most important classes of England, are the gentry. Now, a gentleman, an English gentleman, as French and others observers pointed out, is impossible to define. What is a gentleman? It's not a legal position. It doesn't give you any particular legal powers, or it's not blood-based. It's an ascription. People say, you are a gentleman. And that is because you do the kind of things and you behave in the kind of way that a gentleman behaves. You have a nice country house. You send your children to good universities. You do a lot of noblesse oblige, acting as a magistrate. You speak in not up a posh accent. You spend your time hunting, shooting, fishing, not doing anything very much, but being a gentleman. So, as Tocqueville and others point out, you cannot translate gentleman to gentilhomme. It's a totally different set of bundle of meanings. So the English have this large group who basically run the country through the House of Commons and through local government traditionally. And that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. The nearest to it is perhaps in Japan, which has a samurai. So the samurai, but of course the samurai are armed and somewhat different. So that's the next level. The third level is a huge bunch of people who are pretty wealthy. If they're in the agricultural sectors, they're called yeomen. And I live in a yeoman's house here, which was built 400 years ago. And it's a very pleasant, large house, and you see their houses still in country villages around England. Again, there is no word or concept of what a yeoman is in any continental country. It means middle class, middle to verging on upper middle class. It means people who, as defined in 16th, 17th century treatises, they wear jerkins with silver buttons. They have good shoes. They eat extremely well. They are well educated. They act on local government at a lower level. And they send their sons and children or sons to universities and so on. So the gentry, below the gentry are this very large agricultural class. They don't actually do much direct physical work in the fields, but they earn enough property to have people working for them, servants and others. And alongside them is this other very big middle class, which are merchants and manufacturers and craftsmen and so on, who are also high status and independent and important in all the villages and towns of England. So there's this middling strata, which is very unusual. Usually the social structure of countries goes like this, a very small top and then a huge set of poor people at the bottom. The English is bulged like this. And so you then get down to what used to be called in the peasants, meaning in French, the country dwellers, paysans. And as you know, I have argued in one or two books that they don't exist in England. We don't have peasants in the traditional meaning people who are tied, who are illiterate, who lived out their whole lives in one village and never move in the way that peasants in many parts of the world traditionally lived. They are in Russia or Poland or Mexico or China or India. Well, not China, India. They're tied to the soil. They're not serfs. Well, they are serfs sometimes, but they're not slaves. But they are very immobile and working incredibly hard. The English peasants are not like that. They are much wealthier. They're much more independent, and in many ways different. So, as I've argued elsewhere, so our social structure is unique. Japan is closest to it, perhaps. And then, of course, it was taken to America and has evolved into another parallel system there. And it's totally different. One interesting thing about China is that it has some overlap with this, because the Chinese also, their peasantry is not like Indian peasants. I mean, having looked at accounts of villages and talked to people, Chinese peasants, although destitute and very poor, as I mentioned often, they were very mobile, they were very money conscious. One feature of peasants, as they're described in, say, Italy or Spain, is that they're not part of the money economy at all. They are basically on the edges of it. They barter and so on and so on. And they hardly have any money in their lives. There's a famous Italian film called The Tree of the Wooden Clog, which is really about Italian peasantry in the 18th, 19th century. And the central point is when some peasant finds a bit of money and he's so astonished and it changes his life and so on. So the English peasantry had a lot of money flowing around, as did the Chinese, and both were involved in handicrafts and making things and making money. So there's quite a lot of similarity lower down. And this is very important to realize, because I'm working on a book on Shenzhen at the moment, and if you wonder how this extraordinary phenomenon of a new city of 20 million people was built up in 40 years, and how the people who were flowing in from remote peasant supposed villages in remote parts of China and were putting up each floor of these 80-floor buildings or 100-floor buildings in 3 days. Now, if you've got a load, I don't want to be disrespectful to my country of birth, but if you've got a load of Indian peasants coming in from some very remote part of India, they wouldn't be able to put up a floor of a 80-story building in 3 days, because they weren't trained to do that, and they worked in different ways. Chinese laborers who came into the eastern cities were very sophisticated people. They were quite well educated, and they were very collaborative, and they were used to design work and so on. So the peasantry of England and the peasantry of France, of China, have some overlaps.
It's remarkable, the effectiveness of the Chinese state, the Chinese people in modernity. It was also fascinating to hear you recap something which had become familiar in your work, which was the nature of the class system here in England. And I think it's interesting that the view people have of England and its class system is probably inverse to what you've described, in that they think that the aristocracy is indeed impermeable, that you can't get into it. It's this set establishment that rules over everything, and it's purely to do with bloodlines, and probably don't realize the size of the middle class. I think generally then anyone who's outside of the aristocracy is just considered to be a have-not in the eyes of many people. I mean, I've got German friends and others who say, the class system is just so stark there, and in many ways it's true. I mean, I at least you can see it within social relations. Where people's social standing is quite quickly. But with regards to what you were talking about, the ability to actually move through the ranks, and indeed the economic success, I suppose, of even the normal folks is definitely an interesting wrinkle. Alan, I know we're coming up to the end, and hopefully we'll get to speak again. But final question, at this time on sex relations within England over the years. So in our very first conversation, we spoke about how there was this incorrect view which had become popularized, I suppose, following the 1960s, which was that England, up until the Industrial Revolution, was, as you just said, it was never really, it was a land of peasants, and the Industrial Revolution changed things, shuffled everyone into towns, that kind of thing. And it was heavily inflected by the Marxist view of history. Your work shows that's not the case, and that it goes much longer than that. And I wondered whether we could perhaps look at sex relations in a similar way, which was, how would you describe the relationship between men and women on these isles over the long span of history which you've been studying, and where do you think the common misconceptions are with the stories we tell ourselves now?
So, are you mainly interested in sex relations? In other words, the physiological relation between men and women, or gender relations? In other words, the social status of relative social status of men and women, or both?
Incisive question. Let's go with the gender relations, and then if there's any time to be able to weave in, courtly love, that kind of thing, let's do that.
The gender relations of England are largely misunderstood for various reasons. I suppose the general picture is that of a long-term improvement from a very low base. In other words, the further back you go, the worse the position of women was in relation to men. So it was pretty bad before women got the vote, and Emily Pankhurst and the rest. The Victorians were pretty horrible to their women. When you went back to the 18th century and 17th, 16th, it got worse and worse and worse until one hardly imagines how women survived at all by the time you get back to early medieval period in the Anglo-Saxons. So there's a kind of secular view. It's not clear what this is based on. I think it's just, it is a little bit Marxist in that Marx and Engels wrote quite a bit about the history of the family, and they absorbed this, certainly Engels work absorbed this idea that it was to a certain extent, the Industrial Revolution and its aftermath that freed women from some of the inequalities that they'd suffered from before. As far as I can see, it's more or less total rubbish. If you start at the other end, you start with the Anglo-Saxons. If you look at Anglo-Saxon law, if you look at Anglo-Saxon poetry, if you look at Anglo-Saxon lady saints and writings about Anglo-Saxons, the Anglo-Saxons who came over to England had a very egalitarian attitude towards women. Women were not at the disposal of their husbands. They had individual rights. They had a pretty free life, as far as one can see. When you get to the early medieval period and you look at the laws of England, you find in the great treatises of, say, Bracton at the beginning of the 14th century, you find that women are treated as equal to men in law, except in one case. So women can own property, they can sue men, they can sue a man if he damages them in any way, including physically, including their husband. They are equal to men, except in one, obviously, crucial respect, which is that when faced with a problem of a husband and a wife taking a decision, you have two people. And so if you're taking a decision and one says yes, the other says no, what are you going to do? So the husband has the casting vote. And ideally, he should persuade his wife that this is the thing to do. But basically, and also in marriage, if a woman has serious property, then it is put in trust to be held by her husband. He mustn't abuse the property, and if he dies, then it's still hers, and it goes back to her and her children. But basically, he has the use of his wife's property to a considerable extent. So under medieval law, there is, should we say, a widow is free, an unmarried woman is just equal to a man, but during marriage, there is a marginal inequality. And then if you've been fortunate enough, as I was, to study Chaucer's poetry in the 14th century in England, and you look at what is portrayed in Chaucer's work, the women are dominant. The wife of Bath most famously, but there are other women there. And they're treated as exactly equal. There's no hierarchy at all in Chaucer. And he was a great poet. You then move on to 16th, 17th century literature, and you see Shakespeare. Now, some of Shakespeare's women are a bit subservient, but some of Shakespeare's women are clearly bosses. It's a pretty egalitarian picture you get from Shakespeare, I think, more or less in line with the law, which is that there's a slight edge to being a man. There are certain things you can't do as a woman and so on. And then if you go up to the period of novels, if you get to Aphra Behn, the first woman novelist, and then you look at the 18th century novels up to Jane Austen. Jane Austen's heroines are hardly downtrodden. And the same with the great English women novelists of the 19th century, the Brontes and so on. You know, you can see some power inequality, but it's not very serious. And some of them, women are clearly equal. If you look at portraits, as I was doing the other day, of 18th century schools, they're filled with girls as well as boys. There were many girls' schools as well as boys' schools throughout the 18th and 19th century. Women were educated. So probably the better picture, instead of a sort of starting at a very low base and gradually getting better, you start at a high base, and then there are fluctuations. There is a period in the 19th century, and they changed the marriage laws and the property laws, and women's status seems to decline somewhat in the early to middle of the 19th century, and is only restored by the Married Women's Property Act of about 1870, and they get back to having their own property. And obviously it's improved by changes in the voting systems in the early 20th century. So women have got back to their 18th century. But if you look at the blue stockings, as Sarah, my wife, has done, and the power of some of these women in 18th century families, it's very, very extensive. Now, the Duchess of Devonshire, as my wife reminds me, what is very, what sets it in context is everywhere else. Basically, it's women could complain they're only 70-80% as powerful as men at certain periods and so on. But you just have to look at the women's position in very many pre-modern, pre-industrial societies, and you see women are 10%. They're nothing. They don't have souls. They have no control over their bodies or their property or anything else. And to a certain extent, this is true of China as well. They're married off. They arrange marriages. They're subservient to their mothers-in-law. Their feet are bound, and so on and so on. So I mean, it's summarized by an aphorism that was current in the 16th, 17th century, comparing Italy and England. England was a hell for horses, a purgatory for servants, and a paradise for women.
Mm.
Italy was the opposite. Hell for women, purgatory for servants, and a paradise for horses. Or I can't remember. So basically, England was a paradise for women. Not a paradise, but as things went then, pretty good.
I think there's many more legs in this one, but I will put a pin in it because I could keep you all day. What I will do, though, Alan, because these have been three remarkable discussions. You've had an unbelievable career, and if anyone even goes and looks at all of the works that you produced, they will see that it is prolific, and you're still writing books. I suspect there are quite a few people who, when they're getting sucked into the soul wearying habits of scrolling on social media or feeling like they've wasted their time on the internet, and they wish they'd been producing something of worth, or that they'd followed something like a line of inquiry, as you have in many different areas, they would want to know, what does a professor emeritus do to structure his day? So when you're researching, what's your approach to research and writing and the habits that you've formed over the years?
Well, I think I've formed this. What is curious is that I have done quite a lot of things. But I formed more or less the same habits of everyone in my social class, which is that we were sent away to boarding schools at the age of 8. And from then on, we learnt several skills. One was to concentrate very much on the task in hand. And that was because the first preparatory school I went to, which was the most interesting school in maybe the world, certainly in England, the Dragon School. There's a book by the poet who went there, John Betjeman, called Summoned by Bells. And that's what it describes it. We were summoned by bells. In other words, 45 minutes of Latin, 45 minutes of English poetry, 45 minutes of maths, and so on. So you did that. You didn't do too much of it because you then did all the other things, plays and music and so on and so on. So I learned to concentrate, to achieve something, and then the bells came and you did something else. My great advantage over all the other people who went through this and maybe didn't do as much sometimes was that I wasn't particularly gifted. Having too many gifts as a child can be a great disadvantage. I was not gifted in two ways. One was physically. I was very small. I was very light. I couldn't run fast. As a result, when I quickly appreciated that the way to success in a school like that was through games, I didn't have any of the properties which would make me any good at any games. So I realized the only way I'd be good at games was to think very hard, to plan very hard, and to throw myself into it with utmost vigor. And the result was that I was the only boy in my year in a school of 400 who was on all 4 top teams. And from that I learned, A, that usually if you really try and believe in yourself, you can achieve something against all the odds. And that was a very useful lesson from the world of games and so on. Later I realized there are games that you can't play however hard you try, but up to that bit, and it was the same intellectually. I was he tries hard kind of master's report. Alan is very willing. He tries very hard. He shows promise. He might do something one day. But he's, what I joke with my wife, he's a two-beer. The school had number 1 class. They all went to Eton and All Souls fellowships. then there was 2A, and they all went to a better public school, and they all end up as middle to top civil servants. And then there was 2B, which I was in, and they were, you wouldn't bother to put them in for a scholarship to a good public school, but they might get into a good public school. And so they were okay. They would stumble along. And I was 2B. Now, I realized I was a 2B, and so what was I going to do about it? And what I did about it was to pay enormous attention to planning, to time management, to organization, to memory tools, to the tools of thought. And that increased from about O-level onwards. And so at each hurdle, I just, through hard work and so on, I just leapt in. So I just got into Oxford, second or third try. I just got a top 2-1, but not a first. I just got into, and so on. So basically, the secret is to believe in yourself, to know that anybody can do anything really if they apply it. Einstein, who is one of my heroes, says the same thing. He says, I was not particularly gifted. I'm not particularly good mathematician. And what I've done with my life is through self-confidence and passion and imagination. Combining those three, then I've achieved what I have achieved. So I subscribe to that view. And it's never too late. Basically, if you haven't found this about yourself and the way to work at 30, there's no reason why in this long life we lead, you can't do it at 40, 50, 60, or in my case, 80.
Well, I'll certainly be taking some of that on board. There are far too many projects that have stopped in their tracks for whatever reason. I'm sure there are lots of people listening, watching that will appreciate that advice. And thanks for sharing that very, very humbly as well. And unbelievable to think you are a 2B that reached the top of your game. Alan, I'm going to let you go. I've kept you long enough, and hopefully we'll speak again in the future, though I do know you are even more in demand than you ever were before. And long may that continue.
Thank you very much.
To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel @ThinkingClass and follow me on X @ThinkingClasses. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.